Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Wow, that was weak. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. All right, well, obviously this is the end of the day on day 3. I know how you feel. So we're going to do something a little interactive. So if you know what Service Portal is, please stand up. All right, now, if you know what a widget is, you can remain standing. Good, that's good. All right, now, if you have never set an instance option, please sit down. An instance option. Or if you don't know what that is, you can sit down. All right, now, if you have cloned a widget, remain standing. All right, now, if you have modified the HTML of a widget, you can remain standing. Good, that's very promising. Now, if you have created your own widget from scratch, please remain standing. Now, if you believe that the widget that you created from scratch is really good, please remain standing. Awesome, there you go. Woo. All right, now that wasn't meant to make anyone feel bad. We're all here to learn, and to be honest, I've created my own share of not great code. So today we're going to cover a few things. We're going to talk about good coding practices when you're creating and modifying widgets. We're going to talk about how to make widgets that are maintainable and how to think about performance and optimize for that, and then we'll review some stuff. We are from New Rocket, so if you're not familiar with us, we are a ServiceNow partner. We specialize in Service Portal implementations and componentry and themes. That is all we do as a ServiceNow partner. We do this all day, every day, and if you have a requirement, I would imagine we've probably heard it before. So I'm looking forward to having you challenge us. And in fact, as we go through the session, we're going to pretend like we're all sitting around, nerding out, talking about Service Portal. So please ask questions as we go through here. And my name's Todd Basher. I probably should have started with that. I'm Vice President at New Rocket. I do lots of things. I actually worked at ServiceNow for a while. I directed platform product management as well as leading the custom app solution consulting group there. And then after leaving ServiceNow, I helped this guy grow New Rocket. So I'm going to turn it over to him.
And hey everyone, so I'm Nathan Firth. I have about 20 years in overall web development and UI UX design. Prior to founding New Rocket, I spent a lot of time working with the old CMS platform, building portals, and worked both at customers. I've worked at ServiceNow twice, as well as working at another partner where I focused also exclusively on developing portals. And most recently, before founding New Rocket, I was brought back to ServiceNow by Fred Luddy to help develop the Service Portal product. So I've been literally living and breathing this product for about 5 years now, and it's amazing at what you can actually accomplish using it.
Thank you, Nathan. All right. If you are going around hacking your widget, we will know about it. We feel it. So one of the reasons why we created this presentation is because we are on the community. We're looking at what clients are doing, at what the community is doing, and even some of the challenges that we've run into when we are working with the clients on developing new widgetry. And there's a lot to know, and we want to save you a lot of the pain that we've gone through. So let's talk about, I already kind of covered what we're going to do today, but maintaining good coding practices is super important, and we'll talk about what some of those are. But in a lot of cases with the ServiceNow platform, you can kind of hack your way through it. And you can do that with the widgets as well. The issue is that's going to come back and bite you in worse ways. So we really encourage you to take advantage of the information that's out there and try to follow those coding best practices, even though it may take a little bit longer, it'll pay off in the end. Also, don't hack these things together thinking that you're never going to touch them again. You will touch them again, and if you don't follow those good practices and some of the recommendations, it's going to be much harder to evolve when your boss comes and said, I need this tomorrow. And then also, it's very easy to cause performance problems on your instance when it comes to Service Portal, so we're going to help you avoid that. So some of the big things that come up as we're helping people in the community and as we're working with our own code, as a general rule, the less you have to write, the better it's going to be. Oftentimes, we'll go in, we'll do an initial solution, and we'll say, oh, that works. And sometimes we're thinking, oh, well, maybe we should stop there. But then Nathan will show up and we'll be challenged to be better. And oftentimes, we're able to take away code, and as soon as we're able to take away the code and still resolve the requirement that we're trying to meet, we know we have a much better solution. And we're embracing Bootstrap, we're embracing Angular components and the way Angular works to achieve those results. So when I mention those things, and Nathan will touch on this in a second, with Bootstrap, Bootstrap's a great framework for the CSS piece, and it provides you a ton of utility classes so you don't have to write as much CSS. If you find yourself writing a ton of CSS, you're probably doing it wrong. So really embrace what Bootstrap is doing for you and make as little extra CSS to get the result that you're looking for. And we have a whole talk from last year that goes over best practices around theming and branding. So if you want to look that up from last year or hit us up. And then on the Angular side, of course, there are ways that Angular works. You need to understand that. We're using a very old version of Angular, Angular 1. I think. And so there's a ton of resources out there to help you learn Angular. Please, if you're going to do a lot with widgets, take the time to do that. Also, don't use jQuery. How many of you know and have used jQuery in the past? Yeah, most of you. So you're thinking, oh, I can just, do a bunch of chained methods here and it'll just work just fine. No, don't do that. You need to do it the Angular way, and if you're trying to inject a lot of jQuery in there, do a lot of DOM manipulation, again, you're probably doing it wrong. And then the last thing is, we run into situations every once in a while where we're like, oh, we should just use a timeout there. And as soon as those words come out, Nathan comes up and slaps us in the head. That's usually not where we want to be. And even though, again, that initial solution may use a timeout, we'll then go back and try to refactor so we can take that out. And there are very rare times where you might have to use that, but again, it's exceedingly rare. So if you find yourself saying, oh, I'll just throw a timeout in there, it's probably not going to work. So at this point, Nathan's going to go into a little demo and a little more detail, so I'll turn it over to him.
Cool. And before I do that, I just wanted to touch base on this real quick, because one thing that I find even with our internal development team is usually when I see them writing lots and lots of code, or one of the challenges that we see is it's often because people don't understand all that's available within Bootstrap and all that's available within Angular. So even within Service Portal, you have things like UI Bootstrap that comes with a pretty large collection of functionality and directives that's available. And because most developers don't understand all that's actually available as part of that platform, I find that a lot of engineers keep reinventing the wheel and creating new things that are actually pretty standard within Angular and within Bootstrap. And if you're following good practices with Bootstrap, chances are your HTML is actually going to be pretty slim. And if you're using some of the because the widgets in the CSS is actually using SCSS or Sassy CSS, you also have the ability to create variables. So you can build all of your widgets in a standardized way, update a couple of variables, and then watch your entire portal update all at once. So there is some really good components that are already built out. And the one I wanted to show a demo of here is So I was up really late on Saturday night. I wanted to put together a kind of a quick portal, make it a little funny, but I wanted to show just some examples of some of these things. So this was something we literally threw together right before coming here. But I wanted to show this right here because this is the #1 issue I think I see on the community. We see this coming from everyone from lots of customers to partners. We see this all the time, and that is using jQuery or doing direct DOM manipulation. And the reason why this is, it works. If you're just doing very simple widgets or even a website, there's maybe not anything too wrong with it. But within an Angular environment, and especially within Service Portal, when you have so many different widgets on the page, this will make your life a nightmare. So I wanted to do a quick proof of concept here to show what we're talking about. So we have 2 widgets on the page. We have this cool little rocket that I created, and then we have this widget here with 2 buttons. When I click the green button, we get a cool little animation that shows up. And when I click the red button, I get the exact same interaction. But those 2 buttons do not behave the same. So I'm going to jump in here to code real quick. I was bored with spin there for a second. So let's take a look at the wrong way of doing this. Now, it is jQuery. There's probably a million different ways that we could have handled this, and this was late at night, so this is the particular way that I wrote it. So the first thing you'll notice, instead of using ngClick, we're attaching directly to the ID of the button and doing a .click event. This is very standard for anyone that's, I'm sorry? Yeah, let's do that. Is that better? All right. So we're attaching directly to the ID and doing a .click and then calling a function. So this is very standard for anyone that has done any amount of JavaScript or jQuery development. But this is where it gets a little bit trickier right here, is because we are grabbing the button, we're changing the label directly on the button. This might not be as bad because we're still within the scope of this particular widget, but then this very next line, we are attaching directly to the above widget with the rocket, and we're manipulating the source on the image. The problem with this is because we now are manipulating the DOM outside of this widget, so we no longer have the separation of concerns. And this is why DOM manipulation can really start to bite you, where you have one widget that's behaving one way, but you're not sure why because it's actually happening over here. And we want to be able, as much as possible, to have every widget be responsible for itself, fetching its own data, setting its own CSS, and containing its own HTML. So I wanted to show now, on the good side, another way that this could have been done. So we start off by having a state Boolean here that we start off with set to false. And when you click the button, we're using a standard ngClick event here. We are maintaining the stop and the start labels directly here in the HTML and simply doing it based on the Boolean. And so when you click that button, all it does is if the state was false, it will make it true, and if it's true, it will now make it false, and then we're broadcasting that as an event. Go back here to the other widget. And you'll see here, this one does, all it does is listen for that exact same event, takes the Boolean that is passed in, sets it here to state, where the image now is able to update. So all of the actual image logic lives directly in the HTML, and it's only a single event that's being fired. So it's much more maintainable because you can now trigger that event from any widget anywhere on the page, and this widget will know how to update and when it needs to update. So it's a much better way of handling this type of functionality where you have widgets communicating across. Now, for anyone that's been doing web development for any amount of time, this may seem like this is really, really basic, and it is because it is. This is really kind of, widget development 101. But the reason I wanted to show this is because time and time again, I see DOM manipulation on the community. And we are providing that as a solution, which then perpetuates the problem and makes your widgets and your portal very difficult.
I'm actually curious, why are you using root scope?
I'm sorry?
Why are you using root scope?
Root scope? So, because within Service Portal, if we didn't use root scope, We did a bunch of testing, and in this particular example, it didn't work unless we attached directly to root scope. Some would say that that could be best practice, or not necessarily best practices, but within how Service Portal has been architected, it is the most consistent way to get it working.
Question. Any other questions? All right, so that was an example of coding best practices, and related to that, and what was some of the concepts that were shown there in the example have to do with encapsulation and decoupling. So before I go too much further, encapsulation is the idea that an object on the page is self-contained, that it can work on its own to perform its function. So widgets, by their architecture, are encapsulated. You have the visual representation, you have the client logic, and you even have the server logic that provides the data to that. So you can think of it as an entire mini application, a full stack application that is encapsulated. And so that's the idea that it's a standalone unit. Decoupling is the idea that you're able to separate concerns. Nathan mentioned this. It's the idea that you take, that you can decouple things that can have their own life cycle. So if you have a widget and the logic of the widget really isn't dependent on how the visualization is rendered. You want to render data in a list, but you want to be flexible about how that list looks. Maybe you can decouple the template for that particular widget, but everything else is self-contained. So I hope those concepts are clear, because I'll get to those in a second. But in terms of the idea of making something maintainable, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about cloning widgets from other talks over this week. And when you clone a widget, you are owning that code. And that means that ServiceNow or someone else has developed a widget, and you've decided that something is fundamentally wrong or needs to be changed about that widget, so you're going to clone it, make a copy of it, and you're going to own it. So think about that. If you take a ServiceNow widget and you clone it, it's yours, and if ServiceNow upgrades, you go to a new version, they completely change how it works, they make performance improvements, it's your job to go back and figure out what's different and how you should improve your widget. So I don't know about you, I'm pretty busy. I don't like looking at diffs. So when you clone a widget, you need to have a really, really good reason to do that. And our policy is we need to let ServiceNow own the widgets that they should own. Things that have complex business logic, things that are likely to change from version to version, things like the shopping cart, things like form rendering, service catalog rendering. All of those things are very complex and will likely change from version to version. Whereas rendering a button or a list or tabs, that's something that's probably not going to change from version to version, doesn't have a lot of logic. So we want to let ServiceNow own the complicated things, and we'll own everything else if we have to and we can't use something that ServiceNow provides. So when we say don't clone widgets, we mean don't clone widgets that you don't want to own. And there are situations where you just can't get around it. There's no way for you to get the effect that you're looking for without cloning a widget, and that's okay. You can do that, but you're signing up to own it. So just be really thoughtful, and in, I'd say, 80% of the cases, there's a way to accomplish what you're looking to do without cloning the widget. And you're like, no way, I don't believe it. But yeah, believe it. We're very creative when it comes to doing that. All right, so let's talk about encapsulation. What does this have to do with making maintainable widgets? So when you talk about encapsulation, you can think about things like instance options. Instance options are a way to say, here is widget functionality, and when I drop this widget on a page, Sometimes I want it to be slightly different. I want it to adapt to its environment. So instead of going in there and hard coding something within the HTML, within the client script or the server script, I can use instance options to change the look or the behavior of the widget to make it more flexible. So that keeps that logic within the widget itself. Also, events not only help the widget to be encapsulated, but it also helps with decoupling, because you're saying that this widget, when it hears this message or this event in the system, it's going to do something. It doesn't care who said that, what triggered that event, it's going to handle it. The other thing that has to do with encapsulation is the idea of directives versus widgets and providers. If you're not familiar with Angular, directives look like custom elements. You have divs, you have H1 elements. A directive is a custom element that Angular knows how to render. And if you think about it, a widget is just a directive that you're creating. So you can pull directives off of Google, you can write your own directives. It's a way for you to encapsulate certain functionality. You pass in some options, but you don't care how it works internally. So you can do like a little Russian nesting doll, and you have directives inside your widget, which itself is kind of a directive, and that's in a page, in a portal, etc. So I mentioned that widgets themselves, you can think of them as directives that you can see the insides of, but widgets themselves can depend on providers, on services. Those are encapsulated. They do something and they expose an interface, and so you're just taking advantage of that interface just like the directives provide themselves. So take advantage of encapsulation and make sure that what you're writing isn't leaking its implementation to other widgets. Let's talk about decoupling. How can you decouple your widgets to make them more maintainable? Well, one of the first things you can do is if you have several widgets on the page or in the portal that share the same data, rather than having each widget go out and fetch that data and you're reproducing that logic, you can use a service to encapsulate that logic and then provide that data through an interface to each one of your widgets. I'll give you an example. So you have My Items. You have that in many places on your portal, and the logic needs to be the same on how you count how many items someone has. So you can encapsulate that in a service, and each one of those instances of widgets and code can use the same service. Another way that you can decouple your widgets from business logic is through script includes. The server script in a widget can call a script include, so you can encapsulate all that logic in the script include, and then the widget itself becomes dumber, which is good normally, and it's just calling out to a script include to get its data. The other way, and I mentioned this earlier, to decouple your widget from the presentation is by using templates. So you can have these templates external to the widget or use the same template across multiple widgets and get some reusability across the visual system of your portal. And now I'm going to let Nathan.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I typically making a point when we speak is I do want to make a distinction between what is out of box. And one thing we hear with a lot of our customers is we need to stay close to out of box. And I don't think most organizations understand what that actually means as it pertains to service. What that really means is that you're not cloning those very specific widgets, those ones that ServiceNow is going to be touching from release to release. So probably number one widget not to clone is the catalog item widget. It's not just in major releases, it's in every single patch. And they're not just touching the widget itself, they're also modifying the APIs that it calls. So even if you clone the widget, it's expecting a certain amount of data to come back, but in the very next release, that API that it's calling may or may not change. And so it's just not a good idea to clone that widget. But when we talk about what is out of box, and it has nothing to do with the design or the overall layout. So we can do this portal that I'm showing here actually is pretty close to out of box, even with even with a left-hand menu and a pretty different looking design, this is still fairly close to out of box because we're letting ServiceNow own the majority of their core logic, and everything that we have done custom has just been purely around the UI and the design. So I do have an example that I wanted to go over here because, as Todd mentioned, with a typical My Items widget, usually we have it up here in the header. Oh, So usually we have the My Items drop-down that sits up in the heading, and that fetches its own data from the header menu that is defined on the portal record. But what if we wanted to display another widget on the page that fetched that same data? Normally you would just build another widget, copy, paste all of that code. You would now have another widget that displays it. But what if we actually wanted to do what Todd mentioned here and have it call a script include, so both places and both widgets, both in the header and on the page, could fetch its own data? Another way that we could have done this is using something like a service, which would create typically a singleton where it would actually be the same instance of that data living in both widgets. But for the sake of this example, I used a script include. So the other thing that we run into all the time as we're developing widgets, especially widgets that are going to be reusable, is when we deploy it to one customer, maybe they have made some modifications to the table. Maybe instead of a open by, it's actually u_open by, right? Now we have to go back and modify and clone the widget for this one customer. And then the next customer around, they're going to say, oh, we need to modify the HTML slightly. So how can we develop reusable widgets where a lot of the server script tends to change or the HTML tends to change? And so in this example, I will show some ways that you can do that. So instead of defining all of the fetching of the items and the requests and the incidents, we have this actually done using a script include here, where we're just simply calling a method called getItems. The other thing you'll see up here is the fact that we're calling into options.template. So this is using an option schema, meaning we're defining an instance option that is actually not using a field on the instance table. In fact, it's just being defined using JSON directly on the instance. And we're passing in here a default just in case you don't have this defined. So this is really easy because now when I drag this widget to the page, it's always going to have a default template that it's going to load, and it's going to function as needed. We could also have a option schema defined for which script include we're going to call. So now we could also drag the widget to the page, have it fetch its data. It works great out of box, but if we ever need to override it and modify it, we can do so by simply changing the script include as opposed to having to clone and modify the widget. So if we take a look here at the actual script include itself, you'll see we have this simple method called getItems, which calls in getIncidents and getRequests, joins those together into a single array, and then we have a simple sort function. I wrote this out instead of doing it as a single method. I wrote it out as two methods, so it's easier for me to be able to see where the incidents are coming from and where the requests are coming from. So it just separates some of that logic. And if we go back here, so you can see, a couple of things that I wanted to talk about as far as, because we're talking about maintainable widgets. So again, I made a couple of points here. So we are using an Angular directive here to actually pull up. So you can see here's the default template. We are using the SP_panel directive, which is a directive that ships with Service Portal out of box, and it's just a way to standardize how a panel is being constructed. So instead of having every widget in your portal actually using div class panel, panel default with a panel body and a panel heading, we can simplify by just using this directive, which is going to create consistency across all your widgets. Another example that I wanted to show here is on the CSS side. So I am using some CSS variables or Sassy CSS variables here, and I'm also, these are custom variables that I'm defining, and then I'm also passing in a default. What this allows me to do is I can override what the default is directly on the theme. So perhaps we use this widget in 4 different places, but we want to be able to define what the color is may be defined on the theme, so we can override the default by setting the variable either on the portal record or on the theme record. So this is really good practice for creating maintainable widgets, is having your widget actually leverage CSS variables. And then on, let me see, what was my next one? And then, so yeah, we're using the Angular directive. We've also created the ability to have things like instance options. So you'll see we have the title, the color. We are able to change the glyph, and in this case, we're also able to set the template. So to create a quick example of a template, I created a second one that I just called my debug template. And what this one does is just take all of the data that the widget is fetching and simply breaks it out into JSON. This makes my life so much easier because I'm able to see everything that is actually in scope on that widget. And we're also using that template, able to select it, and calling a script include. So we've essentially created a very highly reusable widget here that we would be able to use on multiple portals, and as the logic needed to change or as the template needed to change, we could do so without having cloning or modifying the widget itself.
How many of you got a little giddy when you saw the JSON? Come on, don't be shy. Yeah, I hear you. All right, the first time he showed me that, I was like, oh, that's so cool. Anyway, I'm geeking out. Let's talk about slow widgets. I hate to break it to you, but how many of you have had performance issues on your portal? Anyone? A few of you? How many found it was your fault? A few of you, yeah. Yeah, that happens sometimes. So let's talk about how you can fix that. So whenever you have a slow widget, there's a few things that you want to look at, and we'll get into those. But generally speaking, one of the ways that you can improve at least the perceived performance with your widgets is by making them asynchronous. And what do I mean by asynchronous? When the portal renders, when the page of a portal renders, what happens is the framework goes out and it collects all of the server scripts for all the widgets on the page, and it executes them sequentially. It gathers up all that data and it shoves that over to the client for it to render. So when I'm saying asynchronous, what I mean is in this first case, you're bypassing the initial execution of the server script. You're letting the widget render on the page first. Once it's rendered, then it makes a call to the server to get its data. Why would you do this? That helps you get something on the page that the user can see. You can get loading indicators, you can have dancing bears, you can do whatever you want, and the user is entertained while you're going and fetching some data. And so you get perceived performance. That's not going to solve the underlying issue, but there is some interaction the user sees, and you can improve the perceived performance. So that's the very first, very basic thing that you can do to get your widget to look like it's going faster. Another way that you can do this is by making your widget asynchronous through the use of REST APIs. In this case, what you're doing is you're taking that logic that you would normally put in the server script, you're maybe creating a script include, and then you're using a scripted REST API as an endpoint for your widget. The widget basically doesn't do anything on the server, it renders on the client, and then you're going to make a call to this REST endpoint to fetch the data. So you're thinking, well, how is that any different than just doing it on the server script? And it seems like it's actually going through more steps. And while it is going through more steps, the thing you have to keep in mind is the payload from the server script is much, much larger than the payload that you're going to get from the scripted REST API. So by reducing the amount of data that you're sending over the wire that you're having to parse, you're getting some performance improvement. You can also use this for third-party APIs that aren't going through ServiceNow. So that's the second way to do that, and it's not just on the initial load of the page, you can also be using the scripted REST APIs or REST APIs in general for any client server communication. Make sense? And then the other thing that can come up to improve performance that I mentioned earlier is the use of a script. Sorry, not a script. Of course, you're going to use that. Service. Thank you. So the service, again, you're able to share data among several widgets and even from page to page. So the idea of the service is even though it's handling interaction with the script include, you can actually cache results within the service. The service itself is a singleton. What that means is that it's only constructed or instantiated once for that portal session. So every time a widget needs to use the service, it's getting the same version of that service as any other widget anywhere on the portal. The only time that service gets re-instantiated is when the user does a hard refresh or they log out or times out. So if you really want to optimize performance, then you can use a service and use some caching mechanism within the service to improve your performance. You have really big lists that you render. You can get that list once, as long as it's not going to change a lot, cache it, and then every time the user navigates through the site, you can see if the cache version is available. If it is, use that to render the widget, and if it's not, you'll make a server request. Yes, question? How does it work with record watchers? That is a great question. So record watchers, maybe I'll have Nathan address this. The idea of a record watcher is you are asking ServiceNow to listen for changes on a particular record or set of records. Record watchers do consume resources, and if you have too many record watchers, you could have potential performance problems. So just be careful with that. The use of a service doesn't necessarily preclude you from establishing a record watcher, but record watchers themselves have to be established within the service portal framework. That's not true. You can do it within the script include, right? Yeah, so go ahead.
I think if you're using a record watcher, it would kind of defeat the purpose of maybe using the service. I'm sure there's some way we could get those to work nicely together, but since the record watcher is constantly sitting there, it's making a long AJAX call that's sitting there waiting and looking for changes. And I suppose you could actually put the record watcher logic directly in the service, but I don't know that you would get the performance improvement that you would expect by normally using the service.
Questions? Other questions? All right. So we're going to do another.
All right, so what I put together here was just a really quick example because I wanted to, the only table I could find that was large enough that had a lot of records that was really going to slow down my system to crawl was the sysmetadata table. So we're going to try this and see what happens. I just set it to 100,000 records. There's actually a lot more, but I didn't want to make you guys sit here for 10 minutes while we're waiting for this. So we're going to try this the slow, painful way and see what happens. So again, this is a non-asynchronous fetching of 100,000 records. Usually takes about 10 seconds. Now, if we jump in here and set it to asynchronous, so it's still going to take 10 seconds, but what it will be able to do is it's actually going to load the full portal, and you're giving the user the experience of here's the portal, and we can show the 3 dots animating to show that this widget is here and it's still fetching its data, and you're not blocking the rest of the site with the typical little loading text up in the top left. So this is a really powerful way to speed up the overall load of your portal. And I find that sometimes it's not a good practice just to go make every single widget on your page be asynchronous, because the way ServiceNow handles those AJAX calls is they do stack, meaning if you have your very first widget if all of your widgets are asynchronous, it is going to start to actually load them one at a time, and then you kind of defeat the purpose. But if the majority of the widgets that are able to load very quickly Just leave them. Those don't need to be asynchronous. They can load the traditional way. And then you leave the outliers, the ones that are going to be taking a few seconds to load, and you can make those asynchronous. And that will greatly improve the overall load time of the page. And I did include one example here, which is just fetching via the REST API. It isn't pulling the exact amount because the REST API doesn't support, I don't believe it supports up to 100,000 records via a single fetch. So it may probably bring back only about 10,000 or so. But all of these widgets that I'm showing here, we are going to be posting the source code on serviceportal.io. So you'll be able to dive into this and kind of take a look at some of the different options and how we did this. Because of how ServiceNow does block, what you'd find is it's very similar if, for example, you were working in the widget editor, you made a change and hit save, immediately jump to another tab and hit reload. ServiceNow is going to wait for that one to save before it's going to allow your next tab to finish. So even though I can click on, maybe the next page or do another operation, ServiceNow is, by architecture, it's going to wait for that first transaction to complete before it jumps to the next.
So those are some code options for getting your portal to optimize what you can on the widget side. But that's not all of the equation. So we had a client that on the dev and test system, no problem. We had standard widgets, everything was working great on their knowledge base. We pushed to production, and it was taking 20 seconds for some pages to load. And we thought, oh, well, what's going on? We really couldn't figure out what was happening. So we went through, we made widgets asynchronous, following these practices, and we were still running into performance problems. So we went a little deeper, and guess what? They were querying their user table, which had hundreds of thousands of people in it, multiple times with their user criteria and their ACLs. So by just making 2 changes to their ACL scripts, we went from 20 seconds down to 3 seconds. So if you're running into performance issues, it may not be a problem with the widget or the portal, it may be something else in your system. So make sure that you're taking a holistic approach and you don't just jump into, oh, I need to clone a widget and make it asynchronous. But if you are developing your own widgets, we do recommend thinking through, okay, how much data am I fetching? What's the query? How many queries am I going to execute? And make sure that you're doing whatever you can to optimize.
Yeah, I think.
So, as I mentioned, you do want to monitor for these slow queries. You want to look at, there's a slow transactions module. It's going to give you a nice list of how long things are taking. So if you do run into performance issues, that's the first place you should go troubleshoot. It's not always the problem, fault of the widgets. And again, if you're dealing with knowledge, if you're dealing with large custom tables, then you can use a service not only to encapsulate the logic for retrieving that, but also maybe using some caching or only fetching that data once and then providing it to all the widgets that need it. And then certainly avoid using unnecessary or nested glide records, and we have an example of that.
Yeah, so when you really think about what is it that makes a widget load slow, it's glide record. It's accessing the database. That's ultimately what's going to take a really long time. JavaScript is incredibly fast at looping through and manipulating data. SQL statements, which is ultimately what glide record's doing for you, is the bottleneck. And so I want to do a quick example here where I took a very typical use case where we're going to go through a knowledge category set, and we're just going to build out the full taxonomy. Now, the easiest way to probably do this, or probably one of the most common implementations of this, is to have a recursive function. So let me show you what that example looks like. So this is how I've seen the majority of customers implement this. If you take a look at even a lot of the out-of-box widgets, they use very common patterns to this. So So what we're doing here is we're calling we have defined a function called getKBCategories. You pass in a parent ID, and for the, because on the knowledge side, it's not a typical reference field, it's actually a document ID reference, meaning it can point not just to one table, but to multiple tables. So the very first thing we're passing in is going to be, let's see where we call it, getKBCategories. We're passing in the actual knowledge base itself, meaning that initial call of this function is going to retrieve the top level categories of this particular knowledge base. Then when we get down to this section right here, so this is inside the while loop, meaning we're looping through all those top level categories. Now I'm going to call that same function, getKBCategories, but we're passing in the current category that we are on so that it can trigger that same function one more time and say, are there any child categories inside this category? And what this will do is it will continue to traverse down the entire tree and continue to find children of children of children of children of children until eventually it has finished building out the entire structure. It's very easy, kind of clean to read. It's not really a lot of code. This is a very common pattern, except for one little issue, which is right here. Every time this function is called, it triggers a glide record query, which then returns maybe 5 results. So it's going to trigger 5 more glide record queries. So when we take a look at what this actually did, is to build out this list right here, we triggered 31 queries. Now, these are very fast queries. We're just grabbing categories, and so it rendered in a mere 30 milliseconds. That is not an issue when you're doing this on your own development environment. But then you go and push this up to production, and you now deploy this to 50,000 of your employees, and now for, heaven forbid, all of them hit the portal at the same time, you would now be kicking off 31 queries per person all at the same time for every active user. So I wanted to show another approach because glide record queries and the sheer amount of the glide record queries that you're executing is going to be probably one of the major bottlenecks of your portal. So with this example, we did the exact same thing using a single glide record query, and I want you to notice what happened here on the execution time, 2 milliseconds. So JavaScript is amazing at looping through data, and it took no time at all for JavaScript to be able to grab everything as a flattened list and then resort things based on its parent and child structure. So again, like I mentioned before, we will be providing this code on serviceportal.io, so you can kind of dive a little bit deeper. But in short, you'll see here what we're doing is we're making a single glide record query with a while loop, and then we're using JavaScript to essentially build out that same array with the parent and the children category. So this is just a very quick and easy example of how you can fetch the data once and then actually build out your structures internally using JavaScript without having to execute multiple glide record queries, because ultimately what is going to make your glide record query is ultimately what's going to make your widgets load slow is the glide record queries. And I will mention one last thing on this, and that is OR queries in ServiceNow when you're dealing with lots and lots of data is also one of the major factors of slowing down your page. We did have a particular customer where we were pulling in the requests. I believe they had about 100,000 requests in that particular table. If you did I requested for query, very quick. When you did when it was the open by, it was, not the open by, it's the other field. What is it? Requested by. Very, very fast. As soon as you put both of those into an OR query, 12 seconds. And in those cases, maybe it would be better to do one or the other or fetch the data and then allow JavaScript to join that data down, because to have a single glide record query that's ultimately going to have an OR condition against a table with that many records, probably going to slow your widget down to a halt. So these are just a couple of examples, but do think about, as you're looking at your widget and focusing on performance, do understand how many glide record queries it is making, and try to understand what is actually happening behind the scenes that ServiceNow is doing on the database.
All right, so let's wrap it up. Make sure when you're out there hacking away at your widgets, which you're not going to do anymore because it hurts us, is to review what you've created, take the time to make strategic improvements, and think carefully about what you're doing. And then just in general, as you're coding, less is better. The less code you have, the less CSS you have, you're doing the right thing. In terms of decoupling, that's going to not only help with the maintainability and the cleanliness of your widgets, it can also, in a lot of cases, help your performance. And then make sure that you're really paying attention to the glide record queries, to your ACLs, to your user criteria, and make sure you're not killing your own performance. So thanks, and if you have any questions, let us know.